Right off the bat, there are two things you need to know about Texas and climate change. First, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Texas produces more oil and gas than any other state. And second, it emits more carbon dioxide. So what's happening at a UN climate summit in Scotland matters here. The question now is, what is at stake for Texas during these negotiations? For some background, let's talk about that summit in Glasgow. Diplomats and heads of state are there trying to set new targets that would quickly curb the burning of coal, oil, and gas that heat up the planet. The mission is to avoid catastrophic warming that science shows would happen if we do nothing. What does that look like? Well, take Dallas-Fort Worth, for example. Average annual temperature has been on the rise since 1970. Based on research from the United Nations, if world leaders do agree to significant emissions cuts, future warming would slowly stop around 70 degrees. If they do not agree, it rises above 74 degrees. That kind of warming will create massive problems. Here's how a new report from Texas A&M lays that out. Because of climate change, we're headed for a future of more 100-degree days, more extreme rainfall, more urban flooding, more intense hurricanes, more severe drought, more risk of wildfire.
Well, as I tell my students, the decisions that are made at this meeting and at meetings next year and maybe the year after, these are going to determine what the world looks like when my students are my age.
In Scotland, the goal is to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 and eliminate them entirely by 2050. In Texas, that would mean a dramatic shift from producing oil and gas to producing renewable energy. The United Nations Secretary General also sees opportunities for Texas. How important is the participation of a state like Texas for the world to achieve its goals? And how do you encourage participation from a state that's so entrenched in the carbon economy?
If Texas wants to be prosperous in 2050 or 2070, Texas will have to diversify its economy, and Texas will have to be less dependent on oil and gas, and Texas will have to be a leading state in renewable energy in the U.S.
When we first aired our interview with the UN, it got a reaction.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott is slamming the United Nations after that group's leaders said Texas needs to be less dependent on oil and gas. Governor Abbott responding on Twitter saying, quote, Texas to United Nations, pound sand.
In Texas, it's also important to understand the politics of climate change. A poll for the Texas Politics Project shows that voters are deeply divided, with 88% of Democrats saying climate change is happening compared to 30% of Republicans. But regardless of political opinion, Texas is actually a leader in renewable energy. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration and trade groups, Texas is America's dominant producer of wind energy and number 2 in solar. So when it comes to the world working together to find solutions, what's at stake for Texas? In one way, we're headed toward a more extreme future just like everybody else's. But in another, as the largest producer of oil, the largest emitter of carbon, and the largest producer of wind, it's hard to imagine the world can hit its targets without Texas helping to lead the way. I'm David Schechter reporting.